Title: The Last Flight of Flight 709. The rain hammered against the airport windows like desperate fingers trying to claw their way inside. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the tarmac in eerie flashes. Flight 709 was the last plane scheduled to depart that night, but something about it felt wrong, like it was never meant to leave the ground. James Carter tapped his boarding pass against his palm as he stood near Gate 17. He was an experienced traveler, but tonight, an unsettling feeling gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched. When he turned around, scanning the terminal, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, just exhausted passengers, busy airline staff, and the occasional flickering light. Overhead, a voice crackled through the intercom. Final boarding call for Flight 709 to London. All passengers must proceed to the gate immediately. James sighed and moved toward the jet bridge. As he walked, he noticed a man standing completely still near the windows, facing the storm outside. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit and motionless. Just as James looked away, the lights flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, a whisper seemed to brush past his ear. "Don't board the plane." James whipped around. The man was gone. Olivia Marsh adjusted her coat as she clutched her notebook. She was an investigative journalist, always chasing the next big story. She had planned this trip as a vacation, but something about this flight intrigued her. As she approached the gate, she noticed the flight attendants exchanging nervous glances. One of them, a young woman with tired eyes, muttered under her breath, "We shouldn't be doing this," she whispered to her colleague. After what happened last time, the other attendant silenced her with a sharp glance. Olivia narrowed her eyes. After what happened last time, she had covered enough cover-ups and classified incidents to recognize fear when she saw it. Pulling out her phone, she quickly searched Flight 709's history. Nothing seemed unusual at first, but then she found an old news article, one that made her blood run cold. Flight 709 had vanished once before. 30 years ago, a plane with the same number had taken off from JFK Airport and never been seen again. No wreckage, no distress call, just gone. Before Olivia could read further, the intercom buzzed again. Final call for Flight 709. All passengers must be seated immediately. She hesitated, glancing out at the storm. Maybe she should miss this flight. Sophia Lane, barely 17, gripped the handle of her carry-on bag. Her knuckles white. She was traveling alone for the first time, going to London to meet her estranged father. Her mother had warned her about flying during storms, but she had dismissed it as superstition. As she handed her boarding pass to the agent, a strange feeling washed over her, as if she had done this before. A memory, hazy and fragmented, surfaced in her mind. A dark corridor, distant screams, the feeling of falling. The agent scanned her pass, smiling mechanically. "Enjoy your flight." Sophia stepped onto the jet bridge, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. Dr. Alan Graves tightened his grip on his briefcase as he boarded the plane. He wasn't a man prone to fear. His work as a neurologist had exposed him to the darkest corners of the human mind. Yet tonight a creeping dread settled in his bones. As he moved down the aisle toward his seat, he glanced at the overhead compartments. One of them was slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine. He swore he saw a pale, slender hand withdraw into the darkness of the compartment. He paused, staring. A flight attendant brushed past him, nudging the compartment shut as if she hadn't seen anything. "You all right, sir?" she asked with a forced smile. Dr. Graves hesitated. "Did you see—" Before he could finish, the intercom crackled. "This is Captain Reeves. We're, cleared for takeoff." The engines roared to life, and Flight 709 lifted into the sky, swallowed by the storm. None of them knew it yet, but they had just boarded a flight they would never return from. At 30,000 feet, the unease that had been lingering around Flight 709 thickened into something almost tangible. The passengers were silent, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of the in-flight screens. The cabin lights flickered once, then again. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His ears popped, but it wasn't the usual altitude adjustment. It felt deeper, more invasive, like something unseen was pressing in on the plane. Across the aisle, Olivia scrolled through her phone trying to get an internet signal, but her screen kept distorting, the text blurring as if unseen hands were rewriting it. She frowned, refreshing it, but now the text read, "You shouldn't be here." She gasped and turned to the man beside her. "Did you see that?" He blinked at her, confused. "See what?" Before Olivia could respond, a strange sound filled the cabin. It wasn't the usual hum of the engines or the occasional murmur of a restless passenger. It was whispering, dozens of voices speaking at once, their words indistinguishable but urgent. Sophia clutched her armrests. "Do you hear that?" James leaned forward. "What the hell is that?" Dr. Graves rubbed his temples. "It's probably just the air system." But deep down they all knew it wasn't. Then the turbulence hit, not the usual brief jolt of movement. This was violent. The entire plane lurched, sideways, sending drinks flying and passengers gripping their seats in alarm. Overhead compartments rattled. The whispering grew louder. A woman shrieked from the back. James turned to see her pointing at something, or someone. A tall, thin man in a dark suit stood motionless at the rear of the cabin, his face obscured by shadow. James felt his stomach drop. It was the same man he had seen at the airport. But before he could react, the lights flickered again, and the man was gone. Sophia turned to Dr. Graves, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you see that man?" "What man?" he asked, frowning. Her face turned pale. He was just there, staring. The plane shook again, more violently this time. The whispers stopped, not gradually but suddenly, like a switch had been flipped. Then a loud thud echoed from the overhead compartments. Something was inside them, and it was trying to get out. The atmosphere inside Flight 709 had shifted from unease to outright panic. The overhead compartments rattled. The turbulence grew worse, and the whispers, though they had stopped momentarily, felt like they were lingering just beneath the surface, waiting to return. Then the first scream rang out. A woman in seat 17B shrieked in terror, her trembling hands clutching at the empty seat beside her. "He was just here," she sobbed. He was right here." Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. James unbuckled his seatbelt and rushed down the aisle. Olivia followed, her journalist instincts taking over. "What happened?" James asked. The woman's face was ghostly pale. She pointed to the empty seat next to her. 17A, the seatbelt was still fastened, the tray table still down, a half-empty cup of soda sitting on it. But the passenger was gone. "He was reading a book," she whispered. "And then he just vanished." "Maybe he went to the restroom?" Olivia suggested, though she didn't believe it. Herself. People didn't just disappear mid-flight. The woman shook her head violently. "No, I was talking to him. We were just talking about how strange this flight felt. I turned to look at my phone for 5 seconds, and when I looked up, he was gone." James and Olivia exchanged glances. Then Olivia looked toward the restroom. "I'll check," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She walked down the narrow aisle toward the restroom at the back of the plane, knocking lightly on the door. "Sir, are you in there?" No answer. She knocked again. "Hello?" Still nothing. Something cold crawled up her spine. She glanced around, noticing something strange. The occupied light wasn't on. Slowly, Olivia pushed the door open. The restroom was empty. She turned back toward the cabin and nearly screamed. The tall man in the dark suit stood just outside the restroom, his face still obscured by shadows. He was perfectly still, unmoving. Olivia stumbled back, gasping. Who are you?" He didn't answer. He didn't even blink, and then the lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, the entire plane was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back, the man was gone. Olivia's breath came in shallow gasps. She rushed back to James and the others. "Something's wrong. That man, I saw him again." James frowned. "Who?" "The same man from the airport. The one I saw at the back of the cabin, but he's just gone." Sophia, who had been silent all this time, spoke in a hushed voice. "People are disappearing." James turned toward the flight attendants, who were standing near the front, looking visibly shaken. "Hey, what the hell is going on? We just lost a passenger. He's not in his seat, he's not in the bathroom. Where did he go?" One of the attendants, a young woman with wide, frightened eyes, shook her head. I don't know. Her colleague, an older man with a clenched jaw, spoke in a whisper. "This isn't the first time. James narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? The flight attendant hesitated. Then, in a trembling voice, he said, "We were told never to fly Flight 709 again." Silence fell over the cabin. Dr. Graves spoke for the first time since the turbulence started. "What are you saying?" The attendant's voice was barely audible. 30 years ago, this flight vanished. No one knows how or why, and now it's happening again. A new wave of turbulence shook the plane. More gasps, more rattling overhead compartments. Then came the whispers, louder this time. Olivia checked her phone again, desperate for any kind of normalcy. But the text on her screen wasn't hers. A message, seemingly from nowhere, had appeared. "You were never meant to be here." The plane shuddered violently. James grabbed the seat to steady himself. "We need to get to the cockpit. We need to talk to the pilots." The older flight attendant looked horrified. "No, you don't understand." But James wasn't listening. He was already heading for the cockpit, Olivia and Dr. Graves right behind him. And when they got there, the cockpit door was open. The seats were empty. There were no pilots, and yet the plane was still flying. A deep guttural whisper slithered through the intercom. "You should not have come." Then the emergency oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and the screaming began again. The empty cockpit stretched before James, Olivia, and Dr. Graves, bathed in the dim, flickering glow of the instrument panels. The autopilot controls were active, yet no one was in the pilot's seat. No hands steered the yoke. No feet rested on the rudder pedals. And yet Flight 709 was still soaring through the storm. James took a cautious step inside, his breath shallow. "Where the hell are the pilots?" Dr. Graves examined the control panel, his fingers ghosting over the illuminated switches. "This isn't possible," he murmured. "Planes don't just fly themselves." Olivia swallowed hard, her journalist instincts warring with the sheer terror, gripping her chest. She reached for the intercom, pressing the button that should have connected her to the flight crew. Static. Then a deep, guttural whisper seeped through the speakers. "You should not have come." The words were slow, deliberate, layered with something that wasn't quite human. Olivia recoiled, her heart hammering. The whisper didn't come from outside the plane, it came from inside the cockpit. Then came the sound. A slow, deliberate click. The cockpit door slammed shut behind them. James lunged for the handle, twisting it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded against the door. "Hey, let us out!" From the other side, muffled screams echoed through the cabin. Olivia pressed her ear against the door, her blood running cold. It wasn't just screaming, it was pleading. Passengers were begging, and something else was answering. Low, guttural voices, speaking in a language that didn't belong in this world. "We need to get out of here," Dr. Graves said, his voice steadier than it had any right to be. "Now." Olivia turned back to the pilot's seat. That was when she saw it. The co-pilot's chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there, its body shrouded in shadows, facing forward, hands resting on the controls. The only visible feature was its mouth, grinning, too wide for a human face filled with too many teeth. A single whisper slithered from its lips. "Buckle up." The plane plummeted. In the main cabin, chaos erupted. Oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling as passengers clutched their seats, screaming. The lights flickered violently, plunging them into brief moments of darkness. Sophia, still strapped into her seat, clawed at her seatbelt, gasping for breath. She turned to the woman beside her, the same woman who had been speaking to the vanished passenger in 17A. The woman was gone now, too. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut, whispering a desperate prayer under her breath. When she opened them again, someone was sitting in 17A. Not the man who had vanished. Something else. It was turned toward her, but Sophia didn't dare look. Every instinct in her body told her not to move, not to acknowledge it. But then it spoke. "You remember, don't you?" Sophia's breath hitched. A tear slipped down her cheek, because she did remember. 30 years ago, this same flight, the same storm, and the way it ended, with the plane disappearing, swallowed whole by the darkness. Sophia had been on this flight before, and she had never left. The plane was still plummeting. James, Olivia, and Dr. Graves clung to whatever they could inside the cockpit, their bodies pressed against the walls from the force of the descent. The grinning figure in the co-pilot's seat hadn't moved, except for its mouth, which stretched wider, splitting its face apart like tearing fabric. James gritted his teeth and forced his way toward the pilot's controls. He grabbed the yoke, trying to pull it back, but the moment his hands touched it, his vision went black. For a brief moment, James was nowhere. He stood in an endless void, cold, silent, suffocating. Then a whisper curled around him like smoke. "It has happened before, it will happen again." A blinding flash. James gasped as he was yanked back into reality. The plane was steady again. The screaming from the passengers had dulled into panicked whispers, the lights flickering back to life. Olivia was gripping the dashboard, her knuckles white. Dr. Graves was slumped against the cockpit door, breathing heavily, and the co-pilot's seat was empty. What the hell just happened?" Olivia stammered, her voice hoarse. James wiped cold sweat from his brow. "I don't know, but I saw—" His voice trailed off as his gaze landed on the control panel. Something was wrong. The time displayed on the instruments read 3:14 a.m., but James knew. Just minutes ago it had been 11:47 p.m. They had lost hours. "Check your phone," James said urgently to Olivia. She fumbled for it, her hands shaking. Her screen lit up. The date was wrong. They had taken off on October 4th. The screen now read November 16th. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. That's not possible." Dr. Graves, his face ashen, pointed toward the windshield. "Look outside." James and Olivia turned, and their stomachs dropped. Beyond the cockpit window, the storm had vanished. There was no sky, no clouds, no stars, only an infinite swirling darkness. And in the distance, something was moving. A shadow, larger than any plane, any building, any mountain James had ever seen. It slithered through the abyss, shifting in ways that defied reason, its form stretching and coiling like liquid shadow. Then it turned, and it saw them. A deep, resonant sound vibrated through the entire aircraft. Not a growl, not a roar, but something ancient, something hungry. The plane's engines shut off. The intercom crackled to life again, the same whisper sliding through the speakers. "You were never meant to leave." The emergency lights flickered. The passengers' murmurs turned into full-blown panic again. Sophia was still frozen in her seat, staring at 17A. The thing sitting there had not moved. It was watching her. Then it whispered, "You remember now, don't you?" And finally, Sophia did. She had been here before. She had died here before. And now it was happening again. Part 6, the passengers that never left. The engines had died. The only sound remaining was the deep, resonant vibration echoing through the fuselage, a frequency that James felt deep in his bones. The void outside the plane was no longer empty. It pulsed, shifting as if something enormous was just beyond. The veil of darkness, watching, waiting. Then the lights inside the cabin flickered out. Screams erupted. James, Olivia, and Dr. Graves stumbled back toward the cockpit door. But as James reached for the handle, it swung open on its own. The cabin was no longer the same. Every passenger was motionless. Some sat rigidly in their seats, their faces frozen in terror, their eyes wide and unblinking. Others were slumped forward as if life had left them. The air was thick, with something unseen, something wrong. Sophia stood in the aisle, trembling. They aren't moving," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James took a slow step forward. What happened to them? Dr. Graves crouched beside a man in 14C and pressed his fingers against his neck. "No pulse," he muttered. He moved to another passenger. No pulse. Passenger after passenger, all lifeless. But then Olivia saw it. The ones who weren't dead. She counted them. 17 passengers were still breathing, but they were different. Their skin was too pale, their chests rising and falling in slow, unnatural rhythms. And their eyes were black. James took a cautious step back. "They're not normal." Dr. Graves looked at one closely. A woman in business attire sat in 22B, her lips parted, slightly, her fingers twitching. As if sensing him, her head suddenly snapped toward him. Her mouth stretched open far wider than humanly possible, and she whispered, "You should not be here." One by one, the 17 breathing passengers turned their heads in unison. James grabbed Olivia's arm. "Run!" The first of them stood up, a man in 10F. His body moving in sharp, jerky motions, stepped into the aisle. The others followed. Their necks cracked as they turned, their limbs bending unnaturally. Sophia screamed as the woman in 17A lunged. James shoved Olivia toward the cockpit. "Get in now!" The possessed passengers rushed forward, their movements more beast than human. Dr. Graves barely managed to slam the cockpit door shut before they reached it. From the other side, a chorus of whispers seeped through the metal. "You should not have come." The walls shook. Something massive struck the side of the plane. Outside, the abyss pulsed, shifting with something huge just beyond the veil of darkness. Sophia clutched her chest, her breath ragged. We need to wake up. This isn't real. This can't be real." But James knew the truth. This was real, and they were running out of time. The cockpit door rattled violently, the whispers outside growing into a chorus of inhuman murmurs. The possessed passengers were not trying to break in, they were waiting. James pressed his back against the control panel, his mind racing. There has to be a way to stop this. Dr. Graves ran a trembling hand through his hair. This isn't just a hallucination. This is something ancient, something waiting for us to arrive. Sophia sat on the floor, hugging her knees. "We're already there," she whispered. "Can't you feel it?" James stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Sophia looked up, her eyes wide and unblinking. "This plane never took off, James. We never left the ground. We've been trapped. Between departure and arrival, we are already lost." A deep, distant groan reverberated through the aircraft. The cockpit window darkened, as if something enormous had moved in front of it, blocking out the abyss beyond. A shape, a presence. Then the intercom crackled to life again. "The door is opening." James turned just in time to see the control panel flicker. A new button had appeared, one that hadn't been there before. It was small, black, and pulsing faintly with an eerie glow. Olivia's breath hitched. "What the hell is that?" James hesitated. His fingers hovered over the button, but his instincts screamed at him not to press it. Dr. Graves exhaled shakily. "If this thing wants us to press it, maybe we shouldn't." But before anyone could react, the plane jerked. A loud mechanical hiss filled the air, followed by the slow, grinding sound of something massive sliding open. And then the cockpit door vanished. Not broken, not destroyed, just gone. Where the door had once been, there was now a vast, endless void. The aisle stretched into nothingness. The possessed passengers were no longer there. Instead, a single open doorway stood in the middle of the blackness, floating in the air, leading to an unknown destination. A faint, pulsing red glow emanated from within. Sophia clutched James's sleeve. "That's the exit," she whispered. "That's how we leave." James's skin crawled. "Leave? To where?" The intercom crackled once more. "Final call. It is time to board." The plane trembled violently. Something was coming. James had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the doorway. James stepped through the floating doorway, his heart pounding. The moment his foot left the plane's floor, he felt a gut-wrenching pull, as if reality itself had snapped like a rubber band. And then, silence. He was standing on solid ground, but it wasn't Earth. The sky was an unnatural shade of black, rippling like liquid ink. A blood-red moon hung overhead, casting a sinister glow. The air was thick, humming with unseen energy, and in the distance, figures stood waiting. Sophia, Olivia, and Dr. Graves stumbled in behind him. The doorway disappeared the moment they crossed. There was no way back. James turned to face the figures. They were the passengers, the ones who had died on the plane, their bodies now standing rigid and silent. Their eyes were hollow voids, their mouths stitched shut. A voice, not from the passengers, but from everywhere at once, rippled through the air. "You were never meant to leave." The ground shifted beneath them. The air became heavier, pressing against their chests. Something massive loomed in the darkness, watching from beyond the horizon. Dr. Graves gasped, clutching his head. "This place, it's not real. It's a trap, a loop." Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. "Then how do we break it?" James gritted his teeth. "We don't belong here. If this is a loop, there must be a way to end it." The figures moved. Their heads snapped toward the group, their bodies twitching, their mouths stretching open despite the stitches, emitting a horrendous, distorted wail. "Join us." James grabbed Olivia's hand and ran. The landscape twisted, shifting like a living entity. The more they ran, the more the world warped around them. And then, the plane reappeared. It was hovering, suspended in the air, its engines silent. The doors were open, inviting them back inside. Dr. Graves hesitated. "It's another trick." James stared at the open doorway, then at the advancing figures. He made a decision. If this is a loop, we have to break it. We have to crash the plane. Sophia's eyes widened. What? James turned to them. If we were never meant to leave, then we force an ending. If the plane was meant to fly but never land, we land it, no matter what. The figures were closing in. They had no other choice. They ran into the plane, slamming the doors shut. The moment they did, the world outside collapsed into darkness. James rushed to the cockpit, Olivia by his side. The controls were dead. The plane wasn't moving, but James didn't stop. He grabbed the yoke and forced it forward. The air screamed. The darkness outside churned, resisting them, but James pushed harder. The plane lurched downward. The figures outside let out a final ear-piercing wail as the plane plummeted. The world shattered around them. James gasped and opened his eyes. He was in a hospital bed. Sunlight streamed through a window. A nurse was adjusting his IV drip. "Mr. Carter, you're awake." His throat was dry. Where am I?" The nurse smiled gently. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. There was an accident, a plane crash. You're the only survivor." James felt his chest tighten. What about Olivia, Sophia, Dr. Graves?" The nurse's smile faded. "Sir, there were no other survivors. You were the only one on that flight." James's blood ran cold. His mind flashed back to the plane, the passengers, the loop. He turned to the window, his breath catching in his throat. Outside, in the reflection of the glass, he saw them. Sophia, Olivia, and Dr. Graves, standing motionless, their eyes black, watching him. And behind them, the doorway was still open. The end.